Morning, folks. I'm on a field trip today, so I wanted to take a little time to give you a bit of background on A Raisin in the Sun prior to our reading it. So we've got a bit of a slideshow here. Please do jot down a few notes on the information, and you will have a series of 4 essential questions to write about at the end. So you should have a piece of paper or a split screen with a doc open to jot down some ideas. So our goal here is to take a look at the historical and cultural context behind A Raisin in the Sun, set during the 1950s in Chicago and written during the Harlem Renaissance in America. And the essential question here for you is, what is the context, both historical and cultural, for this play? One of the essential questions that we deal with is this notion of battling systemic racism, which was far more prevalent, I think, 100 years ago, but I think it's still a very relevant topic today. So perhaps that is one of the guiding ideas that we look at, or the guiding lenses through which we read the play. So our playwright is Lorraine Hainsberry, and important because she is a driving force in the development of African American literature in the modern centuries, and also relevant because her life is what inspired the content and in A Raisin in the Sun. So she was born in Chicago to a middle-class family, relative to the family that she represents in her play. She is a keynote personality in this era, as the first African American woman to have a play produced on Broadway in the late 1950s. She was an award winner as the youngest American and first Black playwright to win the New York Drama Critics Circle Award. And on a personal note, she was a journalist, but also really an activist and closeted LGBTQ author, who also wrote and published for the latter. Noteworthy because on a few different levels she's dealt with discrimination and prejudice and the systemic racism and inequity in the system. So in 1940, the incident that predicated her future here is, about 8 years of age, her family moved to an all-white neighborhood, and even though at that point Jim Crow laws were abolished, there was still a lot of systemic de facto racism present in the world, very evident, and her family faced that in trying to move into this neighborhood. Her father eventually ended up going to court, and the Supreme Court did rule in their favor, but that didn't stop the abusive behaviors that she then experienced further and later on wrote about and chronicled in A Raisin in the Sun. And written during the Harlem Renaissance, which you do want to be aware of is during that era in the 1920s, 1930s, there was a movement that began in Harlem, celebrating and really beginning to spotlight Black intellectual and artistic life, and this is where you saw the developing prominence of several writers who really became, and artists who really became voices and seen as advocates and influences in this time, and to this day have created those influences that have developed the African American voice in multiple facets of our culture. And so you see key themes of pride and Black identity, heritage, and people who refuse to accept the Jim Crow subservience. Another noteworthy voice in this era was the poet/writer Langston Hughes, and he is known for his poetry, one of his most famous being Harlem, which we read earlier in the week, or late last week, and also The Big C text. And part of why we want to make sure he's noteworthy here is not just because he was a noteworthy voice in this era, but also because his poem, Harlem, with the famous line, "What happens to a dream deferred," is the allusion and the title for A Raisin in the Sun, and it poses the rhetorical question that you guys dealt with on Thursday. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Suggesting that when a dream is postponed perpetually for any reason, it can create resentment, it can create negative outcomes, and we see that implication as a topic to be discussed in the play itself. And in A Raisin in the Sun, we see that most relative to what happens when you are denied the American dream, when you are denied access to that dream by forces beyond your control, most notably in this work, systemic racism. And in terms of where it fits historically, it was set during what is called the Great Migration, where families, African American families, moved from rural South to northern cities in an attempt to escape Jim Crow and find jobs. But what they did find was that there was still so much systemic racism and de facto racism. De facto meaning that while racism wasn't law there, it was still very much present and lived through various job limitations, housing limitations, and all of the kind of ugly facets of racism that we still see present today. And we saw that notably, as noted in the slides and in A Raisin in the Sun, Chicago being one of the cities that was largely affected by this. And one of the biggest ways that you see it occurring in that era, but you will see it as a big focus and focal point in A Raisin in the Sun, is that it was primarily seen or portrayed in our play through housing discrimination. In other words, different things happening within the construct of real estate and home buying to really try to prevent African American families from purchasing homes in certain neighborhoods. So still trying to maintain certain boundaries, even though it's absolutely illegal and immoral to do so. And it was keynote for the setting because the setting occurs in the 1950s, just before the Civil Rights Movement. So really the play is set up to kind of speak to the precursor and the events leading up to the movements in the 60s, also indicated by Brown versus the Board of Education and the bus boycott in Montgomery, both happening in that kind of mid to late 1950s stretch, which is also wherein the play is set. And so what you are meant to see as part of this play is the uptick and increase in racial tension as we see a lot more challenge occur and a lot more protest and action start to gain momentum. In terms of big themes for the play, it does deal with the American dream, which is a topic that carries a lot of universality for all of us. You guys have read several texts that speak to that American dream and whether or not it can be attained for everyone. The premise of the American dream is that it is something that everybody can achieve, but you have seen in Of Mice and Men, in The Great Gatsby, and now in A Raisin in the Sun, among others, that the question of whether or not it is achievable in its pure and intended form is once again brought into question. So contend here with this topic of assimilation versus heritage, the idea that in order to fit into another culture, do we ignore our own or forego our original culture and assimilate, in other words, drop our previously held beliefs and cultural ideologies in favor of the place that we now live. You see this happening in this book with our main female character, Beneatha, young African-American woman who is wrestling with her Americanized identity versus the identity that she would have had she grown up in Africa, up against her counterpart George, who is a pretty assimilated African American man in white America. We see this also happening in other texts such as Joy Luck Club and several Amy Tan novels. So it is also a pretty universal concept brought into focus here. Another universal concept here is this notion of family and pride, and how do we maintain dignity in the face of poverty and in the face of insults and in the face of a world or culture that is less than accepting of who we are. And so in terms of how this impacted as a play, A Raisin in the Sun was a beautifully revolutionary moment, culturally speaking. Writer James Baldwin speaks to the idea that it, at that point, had been such a kind of truism in terms of showing what the African American experience was in terms of that systemic de facto racism. He noted that at least in this time in the 1950s, that was the first time that was really shown on stage in a way that resonated for him as an African American writer in this world. It did break some barriers in that it showed an African American or black family as the focal point of the play, and that it was as commercially successful as it was. It has spawned several revivals in the 75 years since on Broadway and elsewhere, and it has stood the test of time, has been adapted into several films. I would argue that the best version is still the Sidney Poitier one, which is black and white, so I will try to look for the best version that I can for you, but I do think it's the black and white one, folks. Sidney Poitier is a great actor, and he does a wonderful job of portraying Walter Younger in this. So that leads us to the essential questions. So as you finish taking notes, you are going to move into drafting these questions and responses to them. Is the American dream attainable, or is it a fallacy? And you can pull in any of your thoughts from any of the other texts we've read, including Of Mice and Men and The Great Gatsby. The second question, is true equality ever achievable? Yes, no, it depends. What are your experiences and thoughts with regard to that? You can think with regard to culture, with regard to gender, identity, religion, etc. The third question is, what is the difference between prejudice and discrimination? A lot of times we will use the two synonymously, but I would invite you to take a look and see what the different shades of those meanings in those words are. And the last question, does assimilation make you a traitor to your origin? In other words, if you forego the beliefs and ideologies of your home, culture, or religion, in order to fit into the society in which you now exist, does that make you a traitor to your original cultural identity or ethnic identity or religious identity or so on? Or is there some middle ground? So remember, there's no right or wrong answer. There's just things that we want to start thinking about and discussing as we get ready to read this text. So feel free to email me should you wish, but I'm excited to see what you think, and I will see you soon. Thank you so much.